There we are. So, I'm going to talk about how natural selection is really important to other fields. And I want to open with the question, how well is natural selection understood? As you might guess, the answer here is, in fact, not well at all. More than 85 studies have demonstrated multiple dozens of misunderstandings about natural selection. I will give just a couple examples for flavor. One is that new environmental challenges spark genetic solutions, as if they can somehow call into being the genes necessary to solve the problem. Another is that natural selection mainly affects only physical structures, as if it somehow just distributes long necks, sharp fangs, and opposable thumbs without also meaningfully influencing behaviors. Now, it happens that these misunderstandings are the rule rather than the exception in society. So, for example, and not surprisingly, students with no instruction in evolution have a lot of misunderstandings about how natural selection operates, but perhaps more troublingly, these misunderstandings are also quite common among undergraduate biology majors, medical school students, students with a master's degree in biology, and high school biology teachers. Now, the question naturally arises, why would this be the case? There are a variety of explanations for this. I personally think that one of the most compelling is that we provide insufficient motivation for people to learn about natural selection beyond simply learning it well enough to pass their high school biology test. So I think it's incumbent upon us to recognize that for a lot of people, they leave high school biology thinking that natural selection merely explains the relationship between species, the way plate tectonics explains the relationship between continents. That is, it's old, it's backward-looking, it's historical, it's not necessary, it's not useful. It's just somehow explanatory. They learn how natural selection works, why it's true, and what it explains, but not how it's useful to them and important to their world. So I think it's really important that we communicate that natural selection has concrete, practical, pragmatic value to all of us today, and that this is not only important to our lives, but to a lot of concrete applications in other fields. My talk is drawing on a forthcoming book of mine called Force of Nature, Understanding Evolution's Deepest Logic and Putting It to Use. The main message here is very simple and straightforward. We are prone to make big and extremely consequential mistakes and to miss important opportunities to improve the human condition anytime we overlook, underestimate, or misunderstand natural selection. That's the message. Now, the talk overview is quite straightforward. I'm going to spend just the briefest moment reminding us, so we're all on the same page, how natural selection works. And then I'm going to pick one example from each of 4 different fields to illustrate the breadth. They're not the only examples, they're not the only fields, but I think it'll give us a sense of the range and spectrum of application. Okay, so the refresher. You may recall that if you have genetically heritable features, plus variation in those heritable features, plus differential reproduction consequent to those variation in heritable features, then you have the 3 necessary ingredients for natural selection as a process to yield evolutionary change as a result. That means features that work will spread to larger and larger percentages of subsequent generations and populations, all else equal. Okay, so far, so good. Now, in terms of applying that knowledge to be thinking about how important it is for us to understand selection pressures that exist in nature and selection pressures that we create, I'm going to start with an example from industrial fishing, and somewhat counterintuitively, our path to fishing is going to lead first through cattle. Now, we've known for thousands of generations, even long before the discovery of genes, that offspring tend to share a variety of important characteristics with their parents, including size. So if we were trying to maximize food yield from a population of cattle for many, many generations, we wouldn't typically kill off and eat the big ones and breed from the runts. No, we would save the big ones for breeding and eat the rest. Now, you might think this would inform our thinking about harvesting fish. In fact, we do exactly the opposite with fish, 180 degrees. industrial fishing internationally is extremely efficient and puts heavy selection pressure on the fish populations that result on our plates. Now, we routinely take the largest and the medium-sized, and we let the little ones go free. Now, you might think this is an enlightened policy. After all, the little fish will go free, swimming through the holes in the nets, and grow up to be big fish. But it doesn't work quite that way. In fact, I think thinking that way commits what I call the sin of assumed invariance. That is, a tuna is a tuna is a tuna. Little tuna will grow up to be big tuna, just like all of their big tuna ancestors. The problem, of course, is that if you take the biggest fish consistently and widely, you create a strong selection pressure against being big. Being big is bad. What does that mean? It means that smaller adults in that population of small fish, that is, small adults that aren't juveniles but have topped out at the maximum size, are the ones that are favored by the selection pressure to reproduce. What does that mean? Their offspring inherit their tendency to be small adults. That creates not one, but two really pernicious problems. One, of course, and the most straightforward, is that the average size of adults shrinks over time toward and approximating the size of the openings in the nets. Okay? They're the ones that survive to reproduce. They're the ones that have offspring. And that shrinks the biomass for future harvesting. Now, the second problem, less recognized, is that smaller females have far fewer eggs. So, an example from Atlantic cod. If you have a female that's half as large as a large female, she does not have half as many eggs to lay each breeding season. She has 1/28 as many eggs to lay. Each of them, incidentally, are lower in energetic caloric quality. Okay, so this shrinks the biomass in another way, not only in size, but now also in number. So the lesson here is, if we don't understand selection pressures, we hurt ourselves, and in this case, also the mouths we feed. We're doing the exact opposite of what we want to have happen. Now, let's switch to another example from engineering. I want to tell a short story here. Once upon a time, there were a bunch of engineers. They were all university trained, top-down thinkers trained in materials science, physics, engineering, executive planning, and they had been developing body armor for some time. And over time, the low-hanging fruit had been plucked, and the question was, where are we going to find new advances in body armor? Someone had the insightful question, what fish swim where piranhas swim? Maybe natural selection has helped those fish evolve a defense to these sorts of attacks. So when you go down into the Amazon, you discover this fish that the locals have long known, named pararaku. It's Arapaima gigas. It is one of the largest freshwater fish. It grows to 14 feet long, and it has the most remarkable scales. Its scales include some of the hardest tissue known in the animal kingdom. The exterior layer, and that's only where it starts, because it biolaminates an exterior layer that is hard, but hardness trades against brittleness, to a subordinate layer that is very tough and very flexible. That means that once any crack starts to develop in that really hard exterior, it doesn't propagate straight through the material into the fish. Instead, it bumps up against this layer of collagen fibers that are oriented in random orientations that functions essentially as nature's ripstop, or in this case, crack stop, and it prevents that crack from entering the fish and doing damage. Now, the lesson here, and there are many, many other examples like this, is that we can often learn from how natural selection has, in the billions of years head start it had on us, addressed and solved a problem that we may be trying to solve from scratch. As a bonus, natural selection never signs its work or gets patents on its inventions. They're just free in nature to mimic and copy. All right, so now let's shift to talk about artificial intelligence. Now, you all know about large language models. There's been a lot of press about them. It's wonderful, it's great, it's fascinating. It is not the only field of artificial intelligence. In fact, there's a subfield of artificial intelligence known as evolutionary computation, and the idea here is to take nature and stick it inside the computer in such a way that you can harness the power of natural selection to solve very computationally difficult problems. And here's how that works. You start with two very preliminary parent software programs. These are just nods in the direction of solving the problem. They don't have to be very good. They can be sketchy. They can just be better than nothing. Then you breed them together. How does that work? You basically mimic sexual reproduction by taking random different 50% from each of the parent programs, combining them together into 100% offspring in a population of offspring that now is digitally, like genetically variable, and you mimic mutation by randomly switching a variety of ones and zeros in these offspring, having programmed however many offspring the parents will tirelessly create. You then rank order the offspring by measuring them against the fitness function, which is simply a way of saying you quantify how, compared to each other, how well the offspring get closer to solving the computationally difficult problem. What do you do then? You mercilessly kill off all the least performing offspring, and you breed from the highest ranked offspring software programs. And you do this again and again. You lather, rinse, repeat. You go home, you make a sandwich, you take a nap, and you come back, and after however many generations you have programmed, you now have an evolved software program that is often very workable as a solution toward your computationally difficult problem. Now, two things here. One is, it's not the optimal solution, but of course, nature rarely provides an optimal. You don't need optimal. You often just need really darn good that can be created relatively quickly. Some of these things can happen in 15 minutes on a laptop that would take literally billions of years with millions of calculations per second to find the one optimal solution to your problem. So if you're interested in something that's just really good and workable, this is a fascinating way to get there. And I'll give you an example. Some years ago, NASA wanted to send into space some microsatellites. These are about the size of a large exercise ball you might see at the gym. They needed a small antenna for their small satellites. It had to meet a variety of mission parameters, including not only size, but temperature operation, beam width, bandwidth, energy efficiency, a variety of other things. And traditionally, NASA would turn this over to their satellite design team. Again, Q, university trained in material science, engineering, mathematics, and physics. And someone had the idea, what if we create a friendly competition between that team and a team that doesn't really know anything about satellite design, but knows how to harness the power of natural selection to evolve a solution antenna that is good and workable to this problem. Now, as it turns out, the evolutionary compute team developed this antenna, which was unlike anything that had ever been put into space by NASA or had ever been designed by any other human team so far as we know. It's filled with odd turns and kinks and angles, but it's remarkable. It was designed in 40% less design time than the human team. It had a significantly stronger signal capacity, and perhaps most impressively, it was 55% more energy efficient. These were the antennas that were sent up into space, first evolved hardware in outer space. Right? So the lesson here is that often we can harness the power of natural selection in the computer to address computationally difficult problems and to achieve a better and faster workable solution, even if it isn't perfect. It just has to be better than the next best alternative, and that's a win. Okay, let's talk for a few minutes about a subfield of medicine known as evolutionary medicine. The core idea here is very straightforward and yet missed by a lot of medical curricula. And the idea here is that the body and its systems are the product of evolutionary processes, including natural selection, and this has important implications for healthcare. Not in every case, but in many. So I'm going to give you a few quick examples. Let's start with an entry-level insight from fever. Now, when you were growing up, and still commonly today, the dominant method of treating someone who has a bacterial infection and is running a fever is to give them a fever reducer. Puts them back closer to homeostasis and often in a more comfortable position. But if you look at this through the lens of natural selection, evolutionary biologists started to ask the following questions. Why does temperature tend to go up when you have a bacterial infection rather than down, or up and down randomly? Why, when it does go up, does it tend to go up just a few degrees and then level off, rather than marching indefinitely skyward until your brain boils? Okay? Why do other mammals also get fevers? And why, perhaps most intriguingly, do cold-blooded animals that get invasive bacterial infections, and here we're talking not about symbiotic bacteria, but invasive parasitic infections, why do they also seek out warmer temperature environments when they're infected? When you start looking at it this way and asking these questions, it leads you to discover the answer that fever is part of the body's evolved defense mechanism to being invaded by pathological bacteria. Now, not every case is this true, but often, perhaps most of the time, if you give a fever reducer to somebody who has an average fever and a bacterial infection, you are undercutting the body's own evolved defense mechanism. Now, how does that work? It reduces the speed with which bacteria reproduce inside your body. Now, that is a huge advantage because bacteria can reproduce about every 20 minutes. That means the population inside you can double about every 20 minutes, increasing exponentially. So if you reduce the speed of that reproduction, it gives the rest of your immune system more time to fight off the invaders. And if you do the opposite, by reducing the fever, you're just lowering the drawbridge for the very barbarians you're trying to get rid of. Okay. Now, a more intermediate level insight, and one with which I'm sure most of you are at least somewhat familiar, has to do with the interrelationship between antibiotics and the evolution of antibiotic resistance. The idea here, of course, is that if you have that genetically variable population of invasive bacteria and you hit them with a selection pressure, which is what an antibiotic is, if you don't succeed in killing all of that bacteria, the ones that remain are the ones that are most resistant to that antibiotic. What does that mean? It means that you have now just killed off all the competitors within the species for that aggressive bacterium, and you have opened up the U buffet, and they just now gorge on all the space that you provided for them by killing off the easily killed. That results in the emergence of what are now called superbugs that not only are a problem for your body, but create what economists call externalities in creating problems for other people who get infected by you. Because now they can't use the antibiotic that you used because you created an antibiotic-resistant bacterium. Now, this has become a larger problem than even those of us in this room tend to think. So, for example, I don't know if you remember what you were doing on January 13th, 2017, but on that day, a woman in the United States, still unnamed in the medical literature, died after her bacterial infection was resistant to not 1, 2, or 12 different antibiotics, but to all, that is 100% of the 26 antibiotics available in the United States at the time. She died just as if there were no such thing as antibiotics in this world. This has led a lot of scientists to say that we have entered a post-antibiotic era. Now, obviously, there's been some attention to this, paid to this in the United States, but we still use a tremendous amount of antibiotics in agriculture and in our livestock. We consume and ingest some of those antibiotics even when you're not thinking that you're taking them. In the United States, doctors routinely prescribe, not always, but far too often, antibiotics for viral infections on which they have no effect other than the collateral effect of helping to breed superbug bacteria. Perhaps most scarily, in most of the world, not sure about most, in much of the world, antibiotics are available over the counter for self-treatment. Okay? this creates a global problem. Now, this also provides a segue to how you can have insights, a more advanced level insight, about new potential cancer treatments. So, the analogy of antibiotics and bacteria also, some scientists think, can run to cancer treatments and cancer cells. So if you think about some cancers, not all of them are this way, there are many different kinds, but if you think of some cancers as a heterogeneous population of genetically variable cells, and you hit them with an anti-cancer treatment, and you don't kill off all the cells, the ones you've left behind are the ones most resistant to the treatment. How many times have you heard, perhaps even with loved ones, the cancer treatment was working very well, and then the cancer came roaring back and killed the patient? This has led some scientists to experiment both in the lab and in some very promising published human trials with something called adaptive therapy. That is, instead of trying to eradicate the cancer in the war on cancer, to eliminate it to the number 0, instead focus on controlling the cancer. That is, as it's growing, hit it with a treatment that pushes it back in size. As it shrinks, stop. Why? Because you have a population size that you can manage with that treatment. If it starts to grow again, dose it more. If it starts to shrink, stop. Now, this approach has led to both lab animals and humans who don't get their cancer cured, but nor do they die of that cancer, right? So if your goal is to try to prolong the life, this is one way, arguably, that you can do it. So there's some fascinating work being done in that area. Okay, so let's take stock. So far we've seen from just these few examples that understanding natural selection and the selection pressures that nature and we as humans create can help us anticipate how selection pressures change species that are not invariable. It can help us learn how natural selection has solved a problem, harnessing the power of selection pressures in the computer. You can adapt and improve healthcare, and many, many other things. In my book, I also look at psychology, economics, and law, but there are still many fields beyond that in which a deeper understanding of natural selection is concretely and practically useful. As you look across those many fields, some themes and some categories of utility, I argue, start to emerge. Just to name a few, you can expose mistaken assumptions. You can improve and refine cost-benefit analyses, and you can identify policy conflicts. So what this means is, as a bottom line, is that understanding natural selection is useful, and it can provide really concrete, powerful, pragmatic aid today in more ways than we tend to think, and in a far wider set of fields than we might initially imagine. Now, just to underscore this point, we undermine our own interests when we ignore or misunderstand natural selection, and we can often improve our lots in life. It's not a magic bullet, but we can often improve things that we care about in dramatic ways. So thank you.